STP is now an official sponsor of Psych Sessions. That's the Society for the Teaching of Psychology. Just a few things that we want to highlight for you. The spring regional conference season is fast approaching. There are 6 regional conferences that meet in April and May, and they're all around the country. STP has great programming at each one, and we encourage you to attend. We also want to congratulate Bethany Fleck Dillon, the inaugural recipient of STP's Civic Engagement Award, and one of our favorite interviewees from Psych Sessions. Finally, STP is seeking editors and associate editors for its publications. Visit the Get Involved page on the STP website for more information.
Hello, and welcome to Psych Sessions, conversations about teaching and stuff. I'm Eric Landrum, along with Garth Neufeld, your podcast hosts. As the name implies, we center on conversations about teaching, but we often veer into other interesting topics, which is the end stuff. This is episode number 87, where Garth had the opportunity to interview Albert Bandura from Stanford University in Stanford, California. Now, before you hear the interview, please allow me to share some listening tips and some of my favorite moments. Now, this was awesome because Garth had the opportunity to actually visit with Albert Bandura in his home in Stanford, California, actually in February of 2020. And so this was a real delight, a real treat. Albert is 94 years old, and it was just an amazing conversation. I don't want to take too much time delaying getting you to it, so I'll speed through my notes here. Obviously, they're going to talk about the Bobo doll. That's what a lot of people want to talk to Albert about. And so as they're talking about it, though, it's really great to hear Dr. Bandura kind of link his work with the Bobo doll to other concepts that he studied throughout his career. You know, when introductory psychology students or teachers of psychology think about Bandura's work, we think about it in the context of maybe chapter 16 of an introductory psychology textbook when we get to that section on observational learning, or maybe the learning chapter when we get it there, or the social psychology chapter, or maybe a deeper dive in a social psychology course. But when he thinks about it from his research perspective, you know, he links the messages coming out of that study or those series of studies. He thinks about modeling and, you know, the learning from modeling, self-regulation, the issue of agency. You know, he was looking at the effects of gratuitous violence and what effect watching violence on television might have on children's behavior. In the, I believe it's late 50s, early 60s, he's actually doing some testimony before the U.S. Senate. And as an untenured professor, assistant professor at Stanford, he's actually a little bit at risk going before Senate and talking about, you know, how TV shows shouldn't be doing what they're doing because of the risk to children. And so it's interesting, it's fascinating actually to hear him talking about that. He's on the forefront of developing his new theory about agency and how it's related to intentionality, self-efficacy, forethought, self-reflection, all these concepts that are so important to us today. Obviously, 50, 60 years ago, he is developing on the fly and interacting with, you know, the leading researchers of the time as they're doing this work. It's really clear to Al that he is so interested in issues of the day. He's not a laboratory researcher just interested in that. He is an applied scientist. He's working with people around the world. He has this notion he calls a moral disengagement theory, that he wants to understand how do good people do bad things and make peace with themselves. And so it's a really interesting discussion that he and Garth have about this. He asked this question, what should psychology do for culture and morality? And so it's fascinating to listen to him and Garth talk about that together. I also, you know, it's also, you get a little bit of inside baseball when Al talks about receiving the Medal of Science from President Obama and the calls from the White House to get him clearance to actually go in And so I'm not going to share any more about that. I'm going to let you enjoy that conversation. Albert Bandura is actually born in Canada, and he received some honors from the Canadian government at one point in his career. He does tell a little bit of his background story about growing up as a boy in Canada. And I think one of my favorite moments was that he's talking about something that I didn't really quite catch all of it, but there were Friday mornings he took a class in French, and I believe they always sang a song in French every Friday morning, and he sings just a little bit of it in the podcast. And it was delightful because, his voice almost returns to that boyhood charm and that bounce. And it reminded me of Bill McKeeche's recording where Bill starts singing in part of his recording. And it was just lovely. It was just a lovely moment that I just truly enjoyed. Al talks about the influence of talking to his mother about what he wanted to do during his senior year in high school, and looking and having those conversations. And that reminded me of other podcasts as well. It reminded me of Ken Keith's podcast where he's talking to his father about whether he's going to be a farmer or study math, and the conversations that he had. It also reminded me of Stacy Spencer's podcast and the conversations that she has with her mother at the dinner table about what her future is going to be, and obviously the role that parents play in shaping their children's futures. And obviously that was the same case for Albert Bandura as well. He actually teaches very late into his career, and that actually reminded me of both Bill McKeeche and Charles Brewer as well. Anyway, I think you're really going to enjoy this, and I just want to give a special shout out to Garth for making the effort and getting this recording and this podcast interview, because I think he did a terrific job. So thank you, Dr. Bandura, and thank you, Garth, for capturing this.
Hi, everyone. It's Garth. Before you hear this interview, I wanted to just say a few words about the interview itself and about how we got to Albert Bandura's house in Stanford, California, because there are some people I definitely need to thank, and I think it's a pretty interesting story. It reminds me of that old adage that you don't have what you want because you don't ask for it. And so I've made a pretty good practice of asking for things that might be hard to get, particularly meetings with people. And I've got to say, over the course of my career, and as long as I've been doing psych sessions, that people are pretty generous and pretty open to doing things out of their comfort zone, in my experience. And I find that just true from psych sessions to my work, my professional work at Cascadia College, to the work I do with our nonprofit, Shared Space for All, which is probably the hardest work because it's fundraising. But, you do get what you ask for when you pursue it, at least part of the time. There's some percentage of the time. And this particular interview with Albert Bandura came out of a series of events. One of them, I'm the director of regional conference programming for STP, which means I visit the 7 regional conferences. One of them, I visit them in a 3-year cycle. So this spring I will be visiting WPA. Now I haven't been to WPA in like 10 years, but I'm going to be going there. And because I'm going to WPA, Diane Halpern and Sue Franz reached out to me and said, hey, would you want to participate in this fun little Jeopardy activity? In fact, you and Eric, would you guys want to captain a couple teams and go against each other? And I said, yeah, for sure. And they said, well, here are the list of speakers or people in the area who might be participating in WPA. And I look down the list, and Albert Bandura's name is on that list. And I thought to myself, I didn't know that he was around the area. I didn't know that he was residing in Northern California still. And so I shot off an email to Jane Hallinan, who is pretty well connected. And I said, Jane, how do I get Albert Bandura onto the podcast? And Jane said, well, I don't know him, but I know Chris Cardone from Macmillan Worth Publishing knows him. And so I contacted Chris Cardone. In fact, Jane put me in touch with Chris, and Chris got in touch with Al, And Al loves Chris, and so she did us a solid by putting us in touch and saying, hey, Psych Sessions is great. And then finally, I had the opportunity to talk to Dr. Bandura on the phone about a week ahead of time, and this interview took place on President's Day, Monday, February 24th, 2020. And so thanks to everybody who was involved in that. Sitting down with Dr. Bandura was very special for me. He grew up just a little ways away from where I grew up, now many years apart, but I'm not sure if you will recognize it, but there's a way that people speak from the prairies of Canada, and it's very sentimental to me. The kinds of language that he uses, the words he chooses to use. And so it really reminded me of being back home. Albert Bandura is possibly the most accomplished living psychologist right now, but he came from very humble beginnings. And that man, that boy, is still inside Albert Bandura, and I think that's fascinating, and we do talk about that. I really enjoyed being in his presence. I enjoyed his laugh. He is one of the most joyful people that I have ever had the opportunity to interview. His stories were hilarious to me. He and I shared lots of laughs, both on mic and off mic. And it's an experience I will not forget. Dr. Bandura, I hope you are listening to this recording. And so I want to thank you on behalf of Psych Sessions podcast. I want to thank you on behalf of Teachers of Psychology. And I also want to thank you for the work that you are doing to try to use psychology to make the world a better place. And that's really near and dear to my heart. So anyway, those are my thoughts. It was a wonderful experience. And thanks for all of you who listen to make things like this possible. And I hope you enjoy it. I'm in Stanford, California right now, and I'm in the living room of Dr. Albert Bandura. We have a studio audience for the first time here, and my wife Danielle is in the room with us. And so that's what's going on. So thanks for meeting with us. It's such an opportunity to be able to come and do this because you're 94 years old. You don't travel, you don't speak much.
No, I've given that up. It's too much of a hassle.
Yeah. But you are answering emails.
Oh, yeah. A lot of people want advice on, for example, self-efficacy.
Right.
And that's globally. For example, if you see that big book there,
yeah,
that's a French translation of self-efficacy.
Which book is it?
This one right on top.
Oh, I see it. Yep.
And so I have quite a few foreign translations. So I get a lot of correspondence on the theory.
Are they doing a good job at translating your ideas into other languages?
France did a beautiful job.
Okay.
I'm just amazed by the quality.
Yeah, well, let's talk about your work for a moment because in my textbook in introductory psychology textbooks, your study must be one of the most regularly cited studies.
The Bobo doll.
The Bobo doll, of course. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, well, it follows me wherever I go.
Mm-hmm.
You see, people don't realize the context in which this was done. Inside almost all our theories were based on direct experience, and that's because it required performing responses and being affected and so on. At that time, television was being introduced. And I was arguing that we have to get beyond direct experience with the transition to information age. And And I looked around and I said, if you look at trial and error learning, I couldn't visualize how you could build a society on that basis. That much of what we learn is based by observation. So you cut short the trial and error and so on.
Was anybody talking about observation at this point?
No, because they actually were rejecting it. Because, see, the theory suggested they didn't know how the hell you could sit there and watch and learn anything without doing anything. It went counter to the theory.
Right.
So they came up with a whole bunch of questions about it. One, you can only learn sort of similar responses, simple responses. You can't learn complex behavior by modeling, and which I then showed was false. Secondly, they felt that you can measure, you can learn responses, but you're missing the psychological determinants of it. So I did research in which people are observing something and describing their behavior, so that they were really using cognition to get behavior by observation. And then the behaviorists also had a theory that you perform modeling responses, you get reinforced, and then modeling becomes an internal drive.
Oh, that's what they did with it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in the meantime, they gave me a hard time.
Who is this at the time? Who are the leading researchers around this time?
The behaviorists.
Yeah, the
of course,
behaviorists.
they're
Yes.
most disturbed.
Was this Skinner, or is this before or after?
Oh, this was before Skinner.
Okay.
And so what I did is I essentially published an article in which I took each criticism and demonstrated the fallacy. Now, the Bobo doll, that was the time that I was doing research on modeling. So I was doing this research, and then this was the advent of television. And the network was operating on the false belief that people are attracted to violence. And so they were using a lot of violence in their programs.
Just to attract viewers?
Yeah, yeah. And often the addition of violence was irrelevant to the plot. When I was testifying before the Senate, Ivan Thors had a program called See Something. And he was very sensitive. He felt that we should use television to educate as well as entertain. And so he had programs in which he was hoping to develop viewers' interest in oceanography, and he could get really very interesting plots. And so he gets a memo from New York saying, your programs are very popular, but you need to take the action from under the water and inject some youth in violence on the beach. You see, that had nothing to do with the plot.
Right.
And he refused to do that. And so they were injecting violence in this way. You see, families were sitting there and watching television. They and their kids are watching this awful violence that was thrown in. So parents start raising hell with the Senate and the House that they wanted the Senate and House to hold hearings on what is the effect of all this violence that's going on.
Because there was no regulation at that time?
No.
Okay.
Well, there isn't any now anyway. So they looked at the psychological research, and it was pretty minor. It's how many hours do kids spend, and it was primarily descriptive. One of the professors who was on that committee, the Senate committee, said, I have a colleague at Stanford who's actually doing experiments on this. And so I began to make many trips to Washington on hearings about the effects of televised violence, and that was with the Senate. And then when Robert Kennedy was assassinated, they had a huge movement to try to study the causes of violence in society. And so
What year were these Senate hearings that you were a part of?
they must have been about late 50s.
Late 50s.
Yeah. And then they were putting pressure on Congress to study the content of violence, its effects, and so on. And so I was making frequent trips to testify. Well, the networks decided that they would kill my reputation. So they hired, there was a psychologist who they paid, and she wrote articles critical of research. The TV Guide had, I think, 7 editorials with titles like "Children Are Not Rats," and the Surgeon General is acting as though Rome was burning, and Bandura is the fire extinguisher. I mean, it was really bad.
Were you did this upset you at the time? Because now you're laughing about it, but was it upsetting?
Well, sure as hell. I'm a untenured professor, and this is appearing in TV columns and newspapers and so on. And I was just an acting professor then. And so I get called by the head of the department, and he says, Al, I've been reading the material that's being published in the public press, and I'm beginning to visualize my vita. And he says, I have only one thing to tell you. Now my heart is really beating. He says, don't let the bastards wear you down. And so
Wow.
I got tremendous help from and then the dean would invite me for lunch, and that's to reassure me that the university will be behind me.
Right, because that's the other big piece. Even if your chair is with you, the university's name is also being called into question.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
And they got their lawyers, and they have to decide whether there's any legitimacy or whether I'm being attacked for my research. So that was kind of an interesting period.
So I've heard you. It seems to me like maybe you don't back down from a fight very well, though, because even when you were talking about the behaviorists, you refuted each one of their criticisms, and now you have these public agencies coming after you, and you're gonna stick to it. It seems like there's something in you that doesn't easily back down.
Well, in the case of the television, I had begun that program research before, and I felt very strongly. There are two ways in which you learn. You learn by doing and learn by modeling. And to have a theory that is restricted only learning by doing is a very narrowing theory of psychology. So that was the origin of it. Mm-hmm. And in retrospect, it seems to me that I'm always taking on topics that were controversial. Modeling was one. Then self-regulation was another one. The experimentalists and so on saying that self-regulation really is false. And I got it from the behaviorists, I got it from the Skinnerians, and then I got it from the neuroscientists. Self-control and self-regulation, these are fantasies. We don't have any awareness or control of networks, neural networks. That's where self-regulation exists. And so I argued that they are making the mistake of looking at self-regulation at the wrong level of control and also in the basis of control. And so this would be an example in which that was controversial and you get a lot of criticism for it, but I stuck to it. Another example, if we get to my early history, it was there that I became fully convinced of the tremendous importance of human agency. So I had research on modeling, research on self-regulation, research on the agency. These are not separate programs of research. No. These turned out to be the principal elements of agency. Most people probably don't know that, but that was the...
Well, can I ask you a question about that? Because the theories that find their ways into, I think, introductory psychology books, or maybe the studies that are recounted there. For example, the Bobo doll study. Often they don't give a context to what was going on culturally, what was going on technologically. Do you think we've missed the point?
Completely.
Okay.
See, the modeling research now it's cited as a modeling study. The context for that is the beginning shift from one kind of society to the information society. Yeah. So, and they don't realize that in that experiment I included the Bobo doll as a way of comparing it with direct experience.
Mm-hmm. So you do Bobo doll, and then you do self-regulation. You're studying self-regulation, agency. How do we move to self-efficacy?
Okay. If you look at the research on agency, they are treating that only that you have a feeling you're capable of effecting change. And my research was suggesting that alone is insufficient, because you can make all kind of plans and goals but not achieve them. And so I was developing a new theory of agency. That agency is the belief that you can affect the course of your life, and you can, and also begin to regulate life more effectively. And then from there I went, my theory says there are different forms of agency. There's individual agency, and that's 90% of all the stuff in philosophy and so on. It's the individual's belief. It's usually intentions. And I said, no, well, that's one, but you can't have an intention and sit around and expect your behavior to appear. So I have a theory of agency that includes intentionality. The second one is forethought. Third is self-regulation, because you got to get beyond goals. You got to motivate yourself to get them done. And then the final ones are self-reflection. We have the capability to look at our behavior and judge its adequacy and the nature, the kind of consequences it's producing, and so on. And then we can change our behavior based on self-reflection. Mm-hmm. And you see all these pieces of research I was doing turn out to be parts of agency. And then I felt that psychological theory has a responsibility to add morality. And that's where I decided to write the moral disengagement book, and the way in which it differs from traditional modeling theories were Piaget and that kind of stuff. And what I want to do now is write a smaller book in language that's more user-friendly, that would be used as a supplemental text in schools.
So I have not read your book on moral disengagement theory. Could you summarize that? What was that next step in your research towards morality? What got you to the morality piece?
I was noticing that there was a pervasive tendency in which good people were doing harm but living in peace with themselves. And that I then built a theory. What they're doing is disengaging their morality from bad behavior and therefore turning it into good behavior. So Trump could say, putting children in cages and separating from the parents is really dealing with the serious problem of migration, and now doing it to purify becomes a positive thing rather than a negative thing. So I found out, as I began to do study and thinking, that there are 8 basic mechanisms by which people disengage their morality. But then I go and demonstrate moral disengagement in every society, every system. For example, I have a chapter on the media, how they were morally disengaging from drama that was. Then the next one is on gun violence, and then I have one on smoking and other health impairing products, and then I have one on capital punishment. Another chapter on terrorism and counterterrorism, and the final one is environmental sustainability.
You've covered so many different topics. Did you have to do a lot of research on all of these in all of these areas?
Yeah, because I didn't know anything about
Yeah.
most of these. And so every morning I'd pop out of bed, run out and get the New York Times to find out who is the new evildoer today. So I had to write it using their words, because otherwise they would say, oh, I'm one of these liberal guys.
What should psychology do for our culture? Because I see even throughout your research or throughout your career, you started with the single person and now you are critiquing society. Is this the future of what psychology should do, or is this just one aspect of?
Well, they better do something, because we're rapidly destroying the planet. In the chapter that I have on environmental sustainability, I criticize the UN severely. They set up annual meetings to begin to get all the countries to agree to a level of reduction of heat-trapping gases. These guys met for 20 years and couldn't agree. Each year they would kick it to the next year. Then they were gonna do it in Paris as the global one. They couldn't agree, so they made gases that were unmeasurable, and so on. Then they went to Poland, and that's year 22 now. So while we're destroying the planet for 22 years, that planet could have been saved by 20 years. And so now they're starting a new sequence, same group, same strategy. I don't know whether they have a social scientist at the UN, but I could have told them at the beginning, if you're going to rely on distal goals, forget it. Because everyone believes, oh, I have a lot of time and we'll get to it later, that our theory in psychology suggests the way in which you achieve the distal goals is by using proximal goals. And you could have found out that after 2 or 3 of these, they weren't making no gains whatsoever. So this whole thing is UN spent 22 years on a faulty psychological model of change. And psychology has to go more global. I don't know, if you look at the American psychologist, is there much there on climate change? It would be hard to find an article. The reason is it takes time. If you're going to make change, you can't test it, a week later. So we do the research in which we can get quick results, and I can understand it. Scientists want to get promoted. I was not only addressing the morality, but also extended from the individual level to larger units, because moral disengagement needs a lot of players. All of them are very pleased with what they're doing.
What year did you write the book, or what year was it published?
3 years ago.
3 years ago. Okay, so you had received the Medal of Science before this.
No, after it.
Oh, after it. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I see. What was that like to have that acknowledgement of your career and contribution to psychology?
Well, I got a call from the White House asking for my Social Security number. I assumed that was a fake.
Yeah.
So I get another email. It's urgent because you can't get into the White House without clearance. So I called my daughter and I said, Mary, would you call this number? They probably want my my credit card and so on. And she called and she said, no, it's real. So what's amazing about it is that you're there with all kind of physical sciences, medical sciences. This is not where there are many psychologists, I think. And that's the first interesting experience. The other is the experiences with Obama. He comes skipping into the room where we're waiting, before the ceremony, and he's got a coffee and a paper bag, a bit of paper, and says, "Okay, we got to work. Line up." So you go and you line up with him, and he takes the photo, and he says, "Okay, bring the family." and so he says, I had kind of an interesting experience on awards, he said. So they brought these kids who were doing very innovative research. And so I was talking to this one kid, and I said, what does it do? Well, this shoots things. And he said, look, I'll show you. He pressed it, and it shot a hole in the wall.
Oh, my.
And he said, this little boy came up to me and said, you have honors for big people. Well, why don't you have one for little people? And he said, that's a damn good idea. And so he was... he made jokes and expressed admiration for the fantastic scientists that were there, and
yeah, I've seen the picture. It looked like it was a very proud moment, a very unique experience that many of us won't have to be honored like that.
It's incredible. Mm-hmm. Because you think about it all the time. It was such a interesting one in terms of that whole atmosphere and
Yeah. You're also an officer in the Order of Canada.
Yeah.
Yeah. Was that something that they just told you that you were, or did you have to agree to that, or
you see, I was born in Canada, and so the Order of Canada is most distinguished people who have made contributions. Mm-hmm. So I didn't apply for it. I didn't expect it. It just comes. They said, we add you to the Order of Canada.
Under which prime minister was that? Was that
Harper?
It was Harper. Yeah. I grew up in Saskatoon, a little ways away from where you grew up.
Yeah.
What was it like growing up in? How did you get from outside of Edmonton, Canada? How did you get all the way to Stanford University?
You see, your question raises the issue of how does a poor farm boy living on the plains of Alberta end up with a job at Stanford University amidst the balmy palms? See, how the hell did I get there? Could you understand why I have a theory of agency?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, so here's the background. Probably no one else has this. My parents migrated from Europe. My father from Poland, my mother from Ukraine. They arrive in Halifax with no money. They and illiterate. And my father got a job laying track for the Trans-Canada Railroad. And these people that were coming in were the new builders of the Canadian nation. So here you have the forests over all that land, and they were developing homesteads. Namely, they would sell a home very cheap, but you had the responsibility of cutting down all the trees and with 2 horses pulling out all the roots and so on and converting it to farmland. There were no homes. There were no schools. No churches. They were just sort of beginning to develop little shops there and so on. So they had to essentially build their own society. They were not adjusting to a society. They were building it. Talk about agency. And then when you bought the homestead, you had to send each year an annual report how much you had already turned into farmland. And it turned out the section that we had was turned in because the person said, this land is uninhabitable, which was not a good sign. No. So that's the background.
So you grew up. You were born there, in that homestead,
in that little town. Yeah, and you see, it was they had very limited educational resources, so all the students, grade first to the end of high school, was in one large school, just one building. And then there were, I think, 3 teachers teaching high school. Okay, and then I had to take some by correspondence. For example, there's no one there teaching French. And so every Friday morning we would turn on the radio to Quebec and sing Sur le pont d'Avignon tout le monde, tout le monde. And so, they were obviously had limited resources. So 3 of us got together and said, hell, we can educate ourselves. And with some help from the teachers, the 3 of us would read a particular work and figure it out. So this was fantastic training in self-regulation in terms of education. Probably 90% of the males turned out to be farmers. They were all farmers. So the principal apparently had administered some kind of test to the class, and this is in high school, and called my parents in, and he said, Albert shouldn't be a farmer, that he should go to college. And my parents said, well, that's kind of nice, but we have no money to send them to college. And but they wanted me to get sort of a broader perspective. So in high school breaks, I would go to Edmonton and work in sash and door shops and so on. And then in the last break, I came home and I said, I found this really great job. It's in the Yukon, and it's good pay, and you get room and board there, and so on. Fortunately, they didn't know where the Yukon was and what I was getting into. So I fly to Whitehorse, and then I see the problem with the Alcan Highway. It's all built on muskeg, so it keeps sinking. So every 80 miles, they had to keep putting gravel on it to maintain the road. And so I ended up in one of these places. And
tell me that was in summer, at least, not winter. That was summer. Okay,
yeah.
Good.
Yeah, but by about 3 in the afternoon, it was dark as hell. It was more with light. And so I take this bus from Whitehorse to my camp, and they're loading up a person. And so I walk up and I introduce myself, and I say, is someone hurt? I said, oh, hell no, that's our cook. He drinks all the lemon extract for the booze, and we have to go and have his stomach pumped out again. So I knew this was not going to be Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. And they were really an interesting group. They're escaping alimony from ex-wives, money lenders are after them, the military is after them, and I suddenly realized that booze was their main thing they wanted. So they give me a little truck and say, Al, you drive to Whitehorse and bring our order. I come to bring the order. All it is booze. So then they decided that they can do their own. So they would order these huge quantities of sugar, and so they were brewing their own. And as they got more alcoholic, they were leaving earlier to test. And then one day, they got up at an awful early hour, and they're off distillation day. The only problem when they got there is the grizzly bears had drank their whole mash, and we had 5 drunk grizzly bears in camp. They were falling over. The dogs were brave as hell because they could be going after them, and they couldn't do it. Oh, can you imagine what kind of background this was? One day in the final year of high school, my mother called me in and said, Albert, you have to decide what you're going to do with your life. You can stay here and till the soil, play pool, and drink yourself to oblivion in the beer parlor, or you might try to get an education. And given the neutral way, and she presented the alternatives, I thought education might be the better form. See, I was saving money working in Edmonton during the summer breaks, and then this payment in Yukon was pretty good. That could take me through 1 year. So I got to UBC, and I still didn't know what I want to major in. And I was going to the campus with a bunch of friends who were pre-med and engineering. And they had awfully early classes. And so I'd be on the campus, and I had to sit around waiting for my next class. So I decided I better look for some kind of filler. And so I'm flipping, and a student had left a class calendar there, which should have been taken back. So I'm flipping through it, and I noticed this thing called psychology, which is a beautiful fit. So I took it as a filler and found my profession.
Did you know what it was other than a good fit? Did you know what psychology was?
No, I was thinking of it more like philosophy.
Okay.
But then I realized, oh no, psychology is different from philosophy. And so I decided that's what I want to major in. And so in the last chapter of this book I'm working, it's titled The Gratuitous Conditions of Life. And so, see, my getting into psychology was by fortuity. And then when I was at Iowa, I met my wife, Virginia, by fortuitous determinant. Namely, me and my friend were late getting to the golf course, so they bumped us to a later time, and there were two women ahead of us, and they were slowing down, and we were speeding up, and I met my wife in the sand trap. Had my friend been on time, that marital relationship would not have ever occurred. But then there was another earlier fortuitous event, and this was in British Columbia at UBC. We had to take 2 PE courses in order to graduate. So I decided outdoor PE will be communing with the muses and so on. And this guy made us run around the track. And about 3/4 way through, I said, I'm going to die of a heart attack. So I decided I got to find something where you don't have to move a lot. And that was archery, because you're standing. The second was indoor PE, and I thought we were going to be dancing to music and so on. And this guy tells us to climb those ropes to dizzying heights. I made a quick descent and said, well, in this one you just walk, so I'll take golf.
Oh, wow.
Fortuity. If in both cases, a few minutes would have made a fantastic difference. So I'm concluding fortuity should not be treated as junk in our prediction models. Fortuity should be taken seriously. And in fact, in the chapter I point out about 12 Nobel Prizes started on a fortuitous determinant. Can you imagine documenting this kind of history?
Unbelievable. So you got your PhD in at the University of Iowa?
Yeah.
And then did you do a postdoc there?
Yeah. Okay. So what happened is I got through UBC in 3 years there because I took a lot of courses in the morning and worked in a session door place in the afternoon. And then during the summer, I worked at a Safeway. So I could now at least have support. So I go to my advisor and I said, where are the stone tablets of psychology? And he says, University of Iowa. And I said, why did they put him there? but anyway, at Iowa, see, I got my PhD in 3 years, too. So from the crummy school in Montreal to a PhD, 6 years. I was going through fast because I didn't have much money.
What was your area of study at University of Iowa?
Clinical
Clinical
psychology.
psych.
Yeah. So I got a job in one of Midwestern universities. It's a 3-year position, and 2 days later, I get a call from Stanford, in which the chair says, Al, we would like you to come here. And the job is a 1-year job. I really wanted to get to the West Coast, you see. So I picked the 1-year insecure job versus the 3-year secure one. My wife says, are you off your medication? What the hell? I don't understand this decision. And so I sort of say, well, I think you prefer to live here than in that Midwest town. So I go to the chair and I said, it's getting late in the term, and I've been looking around for a possible position. And he says, Bandura, I'm going to stop you from making a stupid decision. It's fantastic to be in the same university for all this time. I was teaching for 57 years here, and I was beginning to teach offspring of my former students. There was this undergraduate from their family moved here from Peru, very poor, but really pushing educational development. So this youngster got into Stanford, and he was working on an honors degree. And again, talk about fortuity. He wanted to work with Walt Michel, but Walt said he had too many. And so we're in an arrangement where there are 3 offices, and he is leaving depressed, and my door is open. And he said, I need an advisor, otherwise I can't do that, the program. And so he starts giving me his story, his origin, and so on. And I said, sure, we'll do it. And so he did that, and then he was very much interested in depression, so I got him admitted to Oregon, which had a very good program. Then he graduated, and then he got a position, a psychologist in the psychiatry department at the medical school in San Francisco. And so we correspond, so-and-so. And in his 25th year, he says, I have a sabbatical, or would you support me? I said, sure. So he says, I want to sit in on your course. And I said, yeah, you'll find out whether I changed it. And so then he says, my son is a major in psychology. And then he says, and my daughter is a freshman in psychology, and they are all going to be taking your course. And then the son says, my girlfriend would like to. So there was this whole contingent there. And I said, hell, there's a story here. So I called the press. I said, can you come down with a camera? And sure enough, they have. And that appeared in the campus magazine. Yeah. So the son comes, and, they have to write a pretty extensive midterm paper. And he says, my father claims that he raised me according to your theory. Would it be okay if I write a paper on the congruity of your theory to his child rearing practices? I assume that has to be positive because he wouldn't want to write
Absolutely.
one. He said,
Yes.
no, he was just lying to me. And sure enough, he wrote this glowing paper. And then I figured I don't want to get to the third generation.
So when did you teach your last class at Stanford?
I think I was about 85 then, sometime.
About 10 years ago.
Yeah.
About 10 years ago. Wow. And you've had this long career. You're still writing. You're still reading, it sounds like. When you think about, I don't know if you think about legacy, not everybody does, but when you think about what you've left to the discipline, what are you most proud of, or how do you think about that question if you do?
See, I've never been dissuaded by criticism. And so I'm pleased with the way in which the stuff I was doing got picked up. There's someone who was introducing me an award in the field of health. And so she started out by saying, if you have a paper that's published 10 times, that's pretty good. If you have a paper that's published, 100 times, and then the next one was if it's published 1,000 times, that's phenomenal. So, now here's the results of Bandura's work. Moral disengagement, 90,000 times. Another one, thought and action, 85,000. And there's a third one, which is in the 80 or 90,000. So it isn't that it's been published and after a couple of years it dies. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I like is the emails I get. I have my email work in a form that I can send things that look like form letters in my emails, but are really quite personal. So I get one from Mexico in which he writes that I don't feel that I can achieve anything, and you get the whole depressive. So I write to her and said, life is full of setbacks, inequalities, failures, and so on. But these are the natural things that occur in our lives. Don't let these things interfere with what you want to become. And because those are sort of the natural parts of life and so on. So don't put too much emphasis on them. So a year later, I get an email saying, that email you sent me? She said, I now feel confident as a teacher. I feel very confident as a wife. And so she goes on. So these are the kind of things that really make a difference in your life.
So you've taken all the research, all the years of experience that you have, and now you can actually almost the way a clinical psychologist would can help someone.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah, and use agency and self-regulation in a very, very hands-on way for people.
Oh yeah. So I have a long list. I should show this to you. I have a long list of papers. Students write to me, and this would be at all levels, and a lot are coming in from other countries. they ask about a particular issue, and then I go into my papers list, and it's right there, and I list to the secretary, send them 32.
Interesting.
And that's even the case in these letters I get.
How many of those form letters have you created? You said there's at least 32.
That's a list of almost all of my papers.
Oh, of your papers.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
So I think now I'm selective there,
I see.
but that's about 135.
135.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I would love to see those.
Sure.
And I want to thank you for sitting down with me and doing this. I know for you to open your home to us as strangers is really, really meaningful. And I think that our audience who are teachers of psychology, this is going to be some very meaningful context for them. The next time that they share one of your theories.
And the Bobo doll.
And exactly. When they teach on that next time, they will have more to share about it. And I hope that we all represent you and your research well in our classes. So thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. I hope it was okay for you.
No, it was fun. And I guess it's good for students to see how you can come from such a lousy background and where you end up. So I hope it inspires people who hear it.
Thank you.